The lore of aliens. Colonial Marines begins 17 weeks after the events of the film Aliens. The USS Sephora, carrying a full battalion of Colonial Marines, arrives at the orbit of LV-426. Their mission is the sovereignty of the search and rescue. They are responding to a distress call sent by Corporal Hicks from the USS Sulaco. The lore focuses on the historical weight of the ghost ship. When the Marines find the Sulaco drifting in space, it is not empty. It has been boarded by Weyland-Yutani PMCs, private military contractors. This introduces the lore of the corporate hijacking. The company has illegally seized the vessel to harvest any remaining biological data, setting the stage for a massive military conflict. The story follows Corporal Christopher Winter. He is part of the first wave sent to board the Sulaco. The environment is a haunting recreation of the iconic ship, but it is scarred by fire and combat. This represents the sovereignty of the desecrated icon. As Winter moves through the cryo chamber and the mess hall, he finds that the company has turned the ship into a floating laboratory. The lore of the breach is immediate, as the Sephora's docking tube attaches, the Xenomorphs, which the company was studying on board, escape. This triggers the sovereignty of the absolute chaos, as the Marines find themselves fighting a two-front war against human mercenaries and the perfect organism. The lore of the expendable soldier is central to the Marine experience. Winter and his squad are not told the truth about the Xenomorphs. To the high-ranking officers on the Sephora, this is a standard rescue. But to the company, the Marines are merely interference that must be eliminated to protect their research. This introduces the sovereignty of the military-industrial conflict. The environment of the Sulaco is a maze of gravity shifts and decompression alarms. Winter must use the M41A2 pulse rifle, an upgraded version of the classic weapon, to fight through the hallways. The lore of the pulse rifle remains the sovereignty of the ballistic standard, providing the only sense of security in a vacuum-sealed nightmare. Winter discovers that the Sulaco has been tethered to a massive Weyland-Yutani research station known as the Origin. This is the lore of the parasitic station. The company has been using the Sulaco's flight recorder to track the exact location of the alien hive on the planet below. This represents the sovereignty of the predatory science. The environment inside the Origin is clinical and cold, filled with specimen jars and dissection tables. Winter finds logs detailing how the company managed to board the Sulaco while the crew was in stasis. This reveals the lore of the betrayal, showing that the company had agents embedded in the Colonial Marine command structure. The Xenomorph drones on the ship are more aggressive than those encountered on Sevastopol. This introduces the lore of the hive reinforcement. Because these aliens were birthed on a ship filled with soldiers, they have adapted to the tactics of the Colonial Marines. They use the sovereignty of the ambush, hiding in the ceiling panels and the subflooring. The rookie's motion tracker returns as the primary source of the lore of the rhythmic panic. Each beep represents a potential death from above. Winter's squadmate, O'Neill, provides the heavy support with an M56 smart gun. Their relationship represents the sovereignty of the fire team, where survival is impossible without a partner to watch your six. During the boarding action, a massive explosion occurs on the Sulaco, caused by a Weyland-Yutani sabotage. This is the lore of the ship killer. The USS Sephora is caught in the blast and begins to break apart. Thousands of Marines are lost in seconds. This represents the sovereignty of the tactical disaster. Winter is forced to make a combat drop to the surface of LV-426 to survive. The lore of the dropship is the lore of the final descent. As the shuttle hurtles through the storm-racked atmosphere of the planet, Winter sees the ruins of Hadley's Hope below. The circle is complete. The Marines have returned to the graveyard where it all began. The atmosphere on the surface is a perpetual storm, caused by the atmospheric processor's explosion years prior. This is the sovereignty of the ecological ruin. The lore of the Hadley's Hope remains is one of architectural ghosts. The colony is a skeleton of melted metal and shattered glass. Winter's boots crunch on the silica dust that was once a thriving community. This is the lore of the aftermath. He finds the iconic operations center, now cold and silent. The lore suggests that even after the nuclear blast, the alien hive survived deep underground. This proves the sovereignty of the subterranean endurance, showing that the Xenomorph is a virus that a bomb cannot cure. Winter meets up with a group of survivors in the ruins. They are led by Captain Cruz, a man who is obsessed with finishing the mission. This introduces the lore of the Pyrrhic Command. Cruz refuses to leave until they find Hicks and the data link. This represents the sovereignty of the military dogma, where the mission is more important than the lives of the men. Winter begins to realize that between the company's greed and the Marines' pride, he is trapped in a meat grinder. The environment of the ruined colony is filled with lurker xenomorphs who have evolved to blend in with the shadows of the wreckage. The air on LV-426 is thin and tastes of sulfur. Winter checks his ammunition. He is down to his last few magazines. He looks toward the atmospheric processor crater, where the heart of the infestation lies. The lore of the return to the source begins. He has to find a way to stop the company from extracting the Queen, but to do that, he must enter the very place where the Colonial Marines were first slaughtered. The sovereignty of the recurring nightmare is in full effect. He grips his rifle, adjusts his helmet cam, and prepares to step back into the dark. As this part ends, Winter hears a voice over the encrypted channel. It isn't a Marine and it isn't the company. It's a survivor from the original Nostromo incident, hidden in the shadows of the colony. This introduces the lore of the Witness, a bridge to the past that shouldn't exist. The Golden Age is a radio signal from a grave, and Winter is the only receiver left to hear the truth. He moves toward the source of the signal, knowing that on LV-426, the truth is usually written in blood. Winter and his team push through the freezing, acid rain-soaked remnants of Hadley's hope. The atmosphere of the colony is a haunting landscape of twisted metal and frozen corpses. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the architectural grave. Unlike the clean halls of the Sulaco, the colony is a shattered shell. The lore of the atmospheric processor fallout explains that while the nuclear blast destroyed the primary structures, the reinforced concrete of the lower levels acted as a shield. This represents the lore of the persistent hive. The xenomorphs didn't die. They simply retreated into the foundations, waiting for the heat to dissipate. Winter finds that the company has already set up portable research units inside the ruins, a sign of their sovereignty of the cold opportunism. The environment is a claustrophobic maze of collapsed ceilings and barricaded doors. This is the lore of the last stand scars. Winter finds the medical bay where the colonists made their final stand. The lore of the surgical desperation is visible in the abandoned portable welders and the piles of spent shell casings. This represents the sovereignty of the civilian failure, a reminder that without the proper training, the colonists stood no chance against the biological surge. The motion tracker's beep is muffled by the constant howl of the wind outside. This creates the sovereignty of the auditory isolation, forcing Winter to rely on his shoulder-mounted lamp to pierce the thick, oily fog that has settled in the corridors. As Winter explores the command center, he encounters a new breed of horror, the Raven. This is a massive, heavily armored xenomorph that acts as a territorial guardian. This introduces the lore of the scarred survivor. The Raven is covered in chitinous plates that are resistant to standard pulse rifle fire. The lore suggests that this specific creature survived the 1986 explosion, its shell blackened and hardened by the nuclear heat. This represents the sovereignty of the biological resilience. The Raven does not hunt for food. It hunts to clear its territory of intruders. It is a living tank that forces Winter to use the M240 incinerator unit. The lore of the flamethrower in the ruins is one of pure terror, as the fire illuminates the Raven's terrifying, elongated skull. The Weyland-Yutani PMCs, private military contractors, have occupied the operations hub. These men are the lore of the mercenary guard. They are equipped with smart-core armor and heavy weapons, making them the sovereignty of the human obstacle. The company has ordered them to purge and recover all data, including any surviving Marines who might report the illegal occupation. This turns the ruins into a three-way war zone. Winter witnesses a squad of PMCs being dragged into the vents by the Raven while he is pinned down by their sniper fire. This is the lore of the chaos factor, where the environment itself chooses no sides, only victims. The rookie must use M10 tactical grenades to flush the mercenaries out of their fortified nests. Winter finds a series of black box recordings left by the colony's security chief. These logs reveal the lore of the early infestation. They describe how the company sent the Jordan family to investigate the derelict ship, knowing exactly what would happen. This is the sovereignty of the premeditated sacrifice. The lore confirms that Hadley's hope was never meant to succeed. It was a long-term bait operation. This realization fuels the sovereignty of the Marines' rage. Winter isn't just fighting for survival. He is fighting against a corporation that views children and families as variables in an experiment. The lore of the corporate genocide becomes the driving force for Winter's squad, turning a rescue mission into a quest for justice. Deep in the Sub-Level 3, Winter discovers the lore of the experimental resin. The company has been harvesting the Xenomorph's structural webbing to create bioshielding for their own ships. This represents the sovereignty of the parasitic engineering. The environment here is a mix of human tech and alien organic matter. The walls are pulsing with a faint, green bioluminescence. Winter finds sample containers filled with facehuggers in various stages of development. The lore of the controlled breeding shows that the company has mastered the art of keeping the organisms in a state of artificial hibernation. This makes the facility a ticking time bomb, as one power failure would unleash a full-scale hive within the colony's ruins. The lore of the seismic instability returns as the planet's crust begins to shift. The original processor explosion caused deep fractures in the rock. This is the sovereignty of the dying planet. The floor beneath Winter's feet often buckles, revealing the deep hive below. This introduces the lore of the vertical danger. The Xenomorphs use these cracks to travel between levels, bypassing the Marines' barricades. Winter has to use the M56 smart gun's auto-tracking to catch the creatures as they leap from the darkness of the floor pits. The lore of the bottomless pit is a constant psychological threat, a reminder that the planet itself is trying to swallow the evidence of the massacre. Winter eventually reaches the communication array to try and contact the Sephora survivors. He finds O'Neill pinned down by a group of lurkers. The lore of the lurker evolution is highlighted here. These aliens have developed a smooth, silent gait that mimics the sound of the wind. They represent the sovereignty of the patient killer. Unlike the aggressive drones, the lurkers wait until a Marine is isolated before striking. Winter must use his motion tracker with extreme precision, as the lurkers can mask their movements by staying perfectly still against the cold metal walls. This is a game of tactical sovereignty, where the first one to blink dies. The air in the array is freezing, and Winter's oxygen scrubbers are beginning to fail. He manages to send a signal, but it is intercepted by a Weyland-Yutani high-altitude relay. The lore of the electronic warfare is revealed. The company has a total information blockade around the planet. No message gets out without their approval. This is the sovereignty of the digital cage. Winter realizes that they are truly alone. There is no cavalry coming from the Sephora. They are the only ones left to stop the company from leaving the system with their biological trophies. This solidifies the lore of the Last Stand, as the Marines prepare to move toward the Origin research station. As the part ends, the Raven makes another appearance, crashing through the roof of the array. The lore of the unstoppable stalker reaches its peak. Winter has no heavy weapons left, and the floor is collapsing. He looks at O'Neill, and they both jump into the maintenance chutes, descending into the no-man's land between the colony and the derelict ship. The sovereignty of the unknown depths awaits them. The Golden Age is a shattered concrete dream, and Winter is the only hammer left to break the cycle. They fall into the dark, the Ravens scream following them down into the belly of the planet. Winter and O'Neill survive the fall from the communication array, landing in the pitch-black tunnels that run beneath the colony. This area is the no man's land, a subterranean gap between the human ruins and the ancient alien territory. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the silent graveyard. These tunnels were originally mining shafts, but they have been completely renovated by the Xenomorphs. The walls are no longer rock. They are a thick, wet slurry of resin and bone. This represents the lore of the living catacomb. In this environment, the air is stagnant and heavy with the smell of old acid. The Marines are forced to move without their pulse rifles, as the noise would alert the thousands of creatures sleeping in the walls. The environment introduces the boilers, a specialized and mutated breed of xenomorph. The lore of the boiler evolution is a result of the nuclear radiation from the processor explosion. These creatures are blind, pale, and covered in glowing, acidic pustules. This is the sovereignty of the biological bomb. The boilers don't have the agility of drones. Instead, they move with a twitching, erratic gait, guided entirely by sound and vibration. If they get close to a heat source or hear a loud noise, they rupture, spraying high-concentration acid in a massive radius. This forces the Marines into the lore of the stealth walk, where every footstep on the crunchy resin floor could be their last. The gameplay in No Man's Land is a masterclass in environmental tension. Winter must navigate through sleeping boilers that are fused to the walls and floor. This is the sovereignty of the static threat. The motion tracker is useless here because it picks up the rhythmic pulsing of the boilers' hearts, creating a constant, low-level ghost signal. Winter has to watch the steam vents and listen for the click of the boiler's mandibles. The lore suggests that the boilers act as a final defense for the hive's core. They are the suicide bombers of the natural world, representing the sovereignty of the hive's self-sacrifice. They ensure that even if an intruder survives the drones, they will be dissolved before reaching the queen. As they move deeper, Winter and O'Neill find the lore of the discarded gear. The tunnels are littered with the rusted remains of Colonial Marine equipment from the first mission in 1986. This is the sovereignty of the Marshall Echo. Winter finds a discarded M56 smart gun harness and several cracked helmets. This highlights the lore of the massacre, showing that the original squad was systematically dragged into these depths. The environment is a physical record of the Marines' greatest defeat. For Winter, this isn't just a path to the derelict. It is a walk through the failure of his predecessors. He realizes that the pulse rifle, while powerful, is just a noisemaker in a place that rewards silence. The Weyland-Yutani sniffers are also present in the tunnels. These are small, automated drones sent by the company to track the movement of the boilers. This introduces the lore of the robotic intruder. The company is trying to map the hive without risking their own PMCs. The lore of the automated espionage shows that Weyland-Yutani is treating the hive like a gold mine, looking for the veins of high-quality genetic material. Winter has to avoid these drones as well, because their whirring motors often attract the boilers, leading to a chain reaction of acidic explosions. This represents the sovereignty of the corporate interference, where the company's thirst for data makes an already lethal environment even more volatile. Eventually, the Marines reach the border of the derelict. The environment shifts from the organic resin of the hive to the biomechanical stone of the engineer ship. This is the sovereignty of the ancient architecture. The walls here are ribbed and bone-like, built by a race that understood biology as technology. The lore of the engineer's horseshoe reveals that the ship has become the foundational heart of the entire LV-426 infestation. The aliens didn't just find the ship, they merged with it. The lore suggests that the ship's internal cooling systems are what allowed the hive to survive the nuclear blast. This is the sovereignty of the alien synergy, where two different species of extraterrestrial origin have combined to create an unbreakable fortress. Inside the derelict, Winter finds the lore of the pilot. He sees the massive space jockey chair where the original engineer died. The lore here is one of cosmic indifference. The engineer didn't care about humans or aliens. It was a gardener of death that lost control of its crop. This represents the sovereignty of the fallen creator. The alien eggs in the cargo hold are still there, protected by a layer of blue mist that acts as a stasis field. This introduces the lore of the eternal egg, proving that the xenomorph life cycle can wait for thousands of years in the dark. Winter realizes that as long as this ship exists, the threat to the galaxy is infinite. The Weyland-Yutani ground forces have set up a massive research base directly under the derelict's ribs. This is the lore of the blasphemous excavation. They are literally drilling into the engineer ship to extract the black goo and the eggs. This represents the sovereignty of the industrial desecration. The environment is a clash of high-wattage floodlights and ancient shadows. Winter and O'Neill must sabotage the company's drills to prevent them from waking up the rest of the hive. This is the tactical sovereignty of the saboteur. They are two men against an army, using the dark corridors of the alien ship to strike and disappear. The air in the derelict is cold and tastes of ancient dust. Winter finds a datapad left by a company scientist that mentions a specimen of interest found in the pilot's chamber. The lore suggests that this isn't an alien, but a human survivor who has been kept in stasis for interrogation. This introduces the lore of the captive legend. Winter suspects that this might be the reason Hicks' distress call was sent. The quest for the data link becomes a prison break mission. The sovereignty of the rescue is back on the table, but the price of admission is a journey through the heart of the company's most guarded secret. As the part ends, Winter and O'Neill stand on a ledge overlooking the central chamber of the derelict. Below them, hundreds of PMCs are loading crates of eggs into a transport ship. The lore of the corporate smuggling is fully revealed. The company isn't just studying the aliens, they are exporting them. The Golden Age is a cargo ship filled with death, and Winter is the only customs agent left to deny the shipment. He readies his explosives and checks his motion tracker. The silence of no man's land is over. It's time for the Marines to make some noise. Winter and O'Neill descend into the heart of the Weyland-Yutani research base, which has been crudely grafted onto the engineer's derelict ship. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the industrial parasite. The company has ignored the structural sanctity of the ancient vessel, using high-heat thermal drills to bypass the biomechanical hull. This represents the lore of the corporate butcher. The environment is a jarring contrast. The smooth, dark, organic curves of the engineer ship are pierced by jagged yellow scaffolds and bright floodlights. This setup provides the sovereignty of the shadowed corridor, where the Marines must navigate between the blinding work zones of the PMCs and the pitch-black recesses of the alien architecture. The primary objective is the sabotage of the phase distortion drills. These massive machines are being used to extract the black goo from the derelict's deeper reservoirs. This introduces the lore of the genetic primordial. Winter finds logs indicating that the company isn't just interested in the xenomorphs, but in the source that created them. This represents the sovereignty of the alchemical greed. The environment around the drills is incredibly hazardous, filled with pressurized steam and vibrating at frequencies that interfere with the motion tracker. Winter has to rely on visual cues, watching for the subtle ripple of cloaked PMCs or the sudden movement of alien scouts. During the sabotage, the Marines encounter the Crusher. This is a massive, quadrupedal cast of Xenomorph with a reinforced, bulletproof head crest. This introduces the lore of the living battering ram. The Crusher is an evolution of the runner seen on Fiorina 161, but it has been mutated by the unique environment of the derelict's energy fields. This is the sovereignty of the kinetic terror. The Crusher doesn't use stealth. It uses raw momentum to smash through the company's reinforced barricades and the Marines' cover. The lore suggests that the Crusher acts as the heavy infantry of the hive, specifically deployed to clear out hardened human fortifications. The battle against the Crusher requires a shift in tactical sovereignty. Because its head is immune to small arms fire, Winter must use the M5 RPG-7 rocket launcher or high-explosive grenades. The lore of the flank and strike is essential here. The Crusher is slow to turn, and its flanks are its only weakness. Winter must bait the creature into charging into the heavy drilling equipment, using the environment to stun it. This represents the lore of the David and Goliath, where a single Marine must outmaneuver a biological tank in a space that is rapidly falling apart. The sound of the Crusher's impact against the metal scaffolding echoes like a thunderclap through the hollow ship. As the drills fail, the base enters a state of emergency lockdown. This is the sovereignty of the panic protocol. The PMCs, realizing they are losing control of the specimens, begin a scorched earth policy. They start executing any captive who isn't deemed essential. This leads Winter to the detention block, a series of pressurized glass cells located in the derelict's former cargo hold. Here, the lore of the captive legend is finally resolved. Winter finds a man being held in a specialized stasis field. It is not just any survivor, it is Corporal Dwayne Hicks. The lore of the Hicks resurrection reveals that the body found on Fiorina 161 was a decoy, and the real Hicks was intercepted by the company for his knowledge of the Xenomorph Queen. The reunion with Hicks shifts the sovereignty of the mission. He is no longer just a piece of history. He is the key to stopping the company. Hicks provides the lore of the Sulaco hijack, explaining how Weyland-Yutani boarded the ship while the crew was in cryosleep. This confirms the sovereignty of the corporate kidnapping. Hicks is weak from months of interrogation, but his tactical mind is still sharp. He tells Winter that the company has a high-value asset on a transport ship ready for departure. A Xenomorph Queen in a specialized containment rig. The lore of the Queen's transport becomes the new focus, as the Marines realize they must stop that ship from leaving the planet at any cost. The environment of the detention block is a grisly record of human experimentation. Winter finds hybrid failures, creatures that didn't survive the company's attempts to graft human DNA onto the Xenomorph template. This represents the sovereignty of the biomedical horror. The lore of the White Room sins shows that the company's scientists were trying to create a controllable alien. This adds a layer of moral sovereignty to the fight. The Marines aren't just fighting monsters. They are fighting the people who created them. Winter finds a research ledger that lists Specimen 6 and Specimen 7, implying that the events on BG-386 were just one small part of a larger, galactic conspiracy. The lore of the derelict's heart is found in the pilot's chamber. Hicks reveals that the company is using the engineer's navigation array to find other worlds where the black goo might be hidden. This is the sovereignty of the stellar map. The derelict is being used as a giant compass for a corporate conquest of the stars. This represents the lore of the ultimate expansion. If the Marines don't destroy the research base now, Weyland-Yutani will have the coordinates to every death world in the sector. Winter realizes that LV-426 was just the beginning. The company wants to turn the entire galaxy into a laboratory. The air in the derelict is now thick with the smell of burning coolant and alien musk. The Xenomorph swarm is finally responding to the disruption of the drills. Thousands of drones are flooding the research base, attacking PMCs and Marines alike. This is the sovereignty of the primal chaos. The Marines are caught in the middle of a final purge. Winter must use his M41A2 pulse rifle to keep the path clear for Hicks, who is too weak to run. The lore of the rearguard action is established here, as Winter and O'Neill form a protective circle around the veteran. They are the thin red line against the encroaching dark. As the part ends, the Marines reach the surface of the derelict, looking up at the massive Weyland-Yutani transport ship, the Legato, as it prepares for liftoff. The lore of the escape of the Queen is imminent. The ship's engines are warming up, creating a massive heat signature that lights up the stormy sky of LV-426. Winter looks at Hicks, then at the ship. The Golden Age is a contract written in blood, and Winter is the only signature left to void the deal. He readies his gear for a final assault on the transport ship, knowing that if the Legato reaches orbit, the Xenomorph will be the new master of the galaxy. The Marines launch a desperate assault on the Legato, a massive Weyland-Yutani heavy transport vessel that serves as a mobile research hub. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the pressurized lab. Unlike the derelict ship or the colony ruins, the Legato is a pinnacle of corporate luxury and high-tech security. It is the bridge between the chaos of LV-426 and the boardrooms of Earth. This represents the lore of the corporate cleanroom, where the atrocities committed on the planet are distilled into data and specimens for profit. Winter and Hicks must infiltrate the ship before it reaches the origin station, as once it docks, the reinforcements will be too great to overcome. The environment of the Legato is sterile and clinical, featuring white corridors and sound-dampened floors. This is the sovereignty of the artificial order. However, the lore of the biohangar breach reveals that the containment systems are already failing. The xenomorphs the company attempted to transport have begun to leak through the ventilation shafts. This represents the lore of the contained chaos. The Marines find themselves in a vertical maze of cargo elevators and magnetic tracks. Winter must use the M10 tactical shotgun to clear the corners, as the close-quarters nature of the ship makes the long-range pulse rifle less effective. The sound of the ship's engines creates a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates through the Marine's bones, masking the skittering of claws. The primary objective is to reach the cryo-storage deck, where the company is holding the high-value biological assets. This introduces the lore of the hybrid specimens. Winter finds logs from the lead scientist, Captain Michael Weyland, another Bishop model synthetic, detailing the creation of the soldier alien. These are xenomorphs that have been chemically softened to be less aggressive toward company personnel while remaining lethal to outsiders. This is the sovereignty of the domestication myth. The lore confirms that the company's biggest mistake was believing they could tame the instinct of the hive. Winter encounters these specimens in the observation gallery, where the glass is already beginning to spiderweb from the inside out. The Weyland-Yutani security detail on the Legato is the elite of the elite. This is the lore of the Praetorian Guard. These soldiers are equipped with full-body kinetic plating and thermal vision goggles, making the Marines' smoke grenades useless. This represents the sovereignty of the technological parity. The battle for the main lift is a grueling exchange of suppressive fire. Winter has to use the M56A2 smart gun to track the mercenaries through the shifting shadows of the cargo crates. The lore of the company man is highlighted here. These guards are not just employees. They are true believers in the corporate mission, willing to die to ensure the assets reach Earth. In the heart of the ship, Winter discovers the biohangar, a massive 3-story chamber dedicated to the transport of a live xenomorph queen. This is the lore of the caged goddess. The queen is suspended in a specialized neural dampening field that keeps her in a state of constant, paralyzed agony. This represents the sovereignty of the technological torture. The environment is filled with pheromone vents, designed to keep the surrounding drones docile. However, the lore of the maternal resonance suggests that the queen is still communicating with her brood through the ship's own electrical systems. Winter realizes that the entire ship is a giant, ticking time bomb. The queen isn't just a prisoner. She is a conductor leading a silent orchestra of murder. Hicks, despite his injuries, provides the lore of the saboteur's logic. He explains that they cannot simply kill the queen, as the resulting acid leak would melt through the ship's hull and kill everyone on board. This introduces the sovereignty of the controlled demolition. The Marines must instead target the navigational core to force the ship to crash land back on the planet or steer it into the origin station's debris field. This represents the lore of the suicide run. The environment in the biohangar is extremely unstable, with coolant pipes frequently bursting and spraying freezing gas that can shatter a Marine's armor. Winter has to balance his fire between the droids, the PMCs, and the environmental hazards. The lore of the synthetic betrayal reaches its peak when Winter confronts Captain Michael Weyland in the command sanctum. Weyland reveals that the company has already sent a signal burst to Earth containing the complete genetic sequence of the xenomorph. This is the sovereignty of the information leak. Even if the ship is destroyed, the idea of the weapon survives. This represents the lore of the digital infestation. Winter realizes that the physical war on LV-426 was just a distraction for the digital war for the future of humanity. Weyland's indifference to the lives lost on the planet is the ultimate expression of the corporate sovereignty, where data is the only currency that matters. As the ship begins to experience gravity fluctuations due to the sabotage, the environment becomes a 360-degree combat zone. This is the lore of the zero-G skirmish. Marines and aliens alike are thrown into the air, fighting in a chaotic dance of blood and steel. This represents the sovereignty of the weightless terror. Winter must use his magnetic boots to stay grounded while he plants explosives on the engine manifold. The lore of the long drop is present as the ship's internal artificial gravity fails, revealing the true scale of the Legato's interior. It is a cathedral of corporate greed, and Winter is the one setting fire to the pews. The air on the Legato is now venting into space, and the decompression alarms are screaming. Winter finds O'Neill, who has been wounded by a spitter hiding in the ceiling. The lore of the Marines' sacrifice returns, as O'Neill urges Winter and Hicks to reach the escape shuttle, while he stays behind to manually trigger the charges. This is the sovereignty of the last guardian. Winter refuses to leave another brother behind, leading to a desperate carry and cover, escape through the burning hangar. The lore of the fire and steel is the final beat of this section, as the Marines race against the ship's self-destruction. As the part ends, the Legato experiences a massive internal explosion that tears its midsection apart. The lore of the falling star begins as the ship begins to plummet toward the origin station. Winter, Hicks, and a wounded O'Neill manage to secure themselves in a short-range boarding craft. The Golden Age is a falling laboratory of horrors, and Winter is the only pilot left to navigate the wreckage. They launch from the dying ship just as the Queen's containment field fails, her final scream being cut off by the vacuum of space. The Marines are heading for the origin station for the final confrontation with the heart of the company. The boarding craft slams into the docking bay of the Origin, the massive Weyland-Yutani command station orbiting LV-426. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the corporate core. This is the brain of the entire operation, a facility designed to survive a planetary collapse. Unlike the ships or the colony, the Origin is a permanent fortress of glass and brushed steel, representing the lore of the unreachable elite. Here, the company's true power is on display. The environment is eerily quiet, filled with executive suites and biometric labs that suggest a level of comfort and safety far removed from the acid-splashed hell of the surface. This is the sovereignty of the ivory tower, where the decisions that killed thousands were made in air-conditioned silence. The primary objective is to reach the central data core to stop the transmission of the Xenomorph genetic sequence to Earth. This introduces the lore of the digital hive. The Origin is managed by an advanced AI system, similar to Apollo, but more focused on security and secrecy. This is the sovereignty of the mechanical gatekeeper. The AI controls every door, turret, and life support system in the facility. Winter and Hicks must move through the main access shaft, a massive vertical tube that connects the station's sectors. The lore of the vertical battlefield is established as the Marines fight gravity and automated defenses simultaneously. Winter has to use the M4A3 service pistol for precision shots against the AI's optic sensors. In the lower levels of the Origin, Winter discovers the hybrid research wing. This is the darkest chapter of the lore, the sovereignty of the biological sin. Here, the company has been attempting to create the ultimate life form by splicing xenomorph DNA with human subjects. This introduces the lurker hybrid, a creature that possesses human-like skin and intelligence but retains the lethal instincts of the xenomorph. This represents the lore of the blasphemous mirror. The environment is filled with incubation tanks holding failed experiments, creatures with too many limbs or distorted human faces. This is the sovereignty of the ethical void, where the line between science and murder has been completely erased. The Weyland-Yutani Black Ops teams are the primary human threat in this sector. This is the lore of the Shadow Soldiers. These men are the company's personal assassins, equipped with active camouflage and sonic disruptors. This represents the sovereignty of the invisible war. Winter must rely heavily on his motion tracker, as these soldiers are nearly invisible to the naked eye. The lore of the ghost in the machine describes how the company uses these teams to clean up anyone who sees too much. The battle in the cryo-storage lab is a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, where a single mistake results in a silent blade to the throat. Winter has to use thermal goggles to level the playing field. During the infiltration, Hicks provides the lore of the 1986 cover-up. He explains that the company didn't just want the alien. They wanted to bury the fact that the Colonial Marines had even existed on LV-426. This is the sovereignty of the historical erasure. The Origin contains the original mission logs of the Nostromo and the Sulaco, hidden behind Level 9 encryption. The lore of the truth in the vault becomes the Marines' secondary goal. If they can download these files, they can destroy the company's reputation forever. This represents the lore of the information bomb, where a single data drive is more powerful than a pulse rifle. The environment of the central data core is a massive, chilled room filled with server racks that stretch for miles. This is the sovereignty of the silicon cold. The lore of the data steam describes how the company's entire history is stored here in a state of cryogenic preservation. As Winter begins the download, the AI triggers a fail-safe purge, venting the oxygen from the room. This introduces the sovereignty of the suffocation. The Marines must fight through the logic guards, robotic units designed to protect the servers, while their own air supplies dwindle. This is the lore of the breathless fight, a race against time where every bullet fired consumes precious oxygen. Winter encounters the lore of the synthetic director. He finds a terminal containing the consciousness of a high-ranking Weyland-Yutani official who has uploaded his mind to the station's network. This is the sovereignty of the digital god complex. The director mocks Winter, explaining that the company is no longer a group of people, but a persistent idea that cannot be killed with guns. This represents the lore of the corporate immortal. Winter realizes that even if they blow up the origin, the will of Weyland-Yutani will simply migrate to another station. This adds a layer of philosophical sovereignty to the mission. They aren't just fighting a facility, they are fighting a way of life. The lore of the hybrid queen is the final horror of the station. In the deepest research pit, the company has been growing a genetic template of a queen using the DNA of the original Nostromo survivor, Ellen Ripley, a direct nod to the events that lead to alien resurrection. This is the sovereignty of the stolen legacy. The environment here is a biodigital nursery, where the creature is fed data and nutrients through a web of tubes. The lore suggests that the company wants a queen that can be programmed like a computer. This is the lore of the obedient monster, the ultimate goal of the specimen projects. Winter must destroy the template before it can be finalized. As the part ends, the origin station begins to vibrate. The sabotage on the Legato has caused a cascade failure in the station's docking ring. The lore of the orbital decay begins as the massive structure starts to tip toward the atmosphere of LV-426. Winter, Hicks, and O'Neill are trapped in the data core, surrounded by Black Ops teams and the screeching of the hybrid queen as she wakes up. The Golden Age is a glass fortress on fire, and Winter is the only sledgehammer left to shatter the foundation. He grabs the data drive, readies his explosives, and prepares for the final push toward the station's command deck. The origin station begins its agonizing descent into the upper atmosphere of LV-426, the friction of the air turning the outer hull into a glowing orange shield. The lore here centers on the sovereignty of the falling giant. As the station's artificial gravity begins to fail and fluctuate, the environment becomes a lethal playground of shifting physics. This represents the lore of the kinetic chaos. Winter, Hicks, and O'Neill must fight their way from the shattered data core toward the command deck, where the true leadership and the means of escape are located. The halls of the station are now filled with the sound of groaning metal and the roar of atmospheric entry, masking the screams of the dying hybrid specimens that have escaped their tanks. The environment of the command deck is the pinnacle of corporate opulence, featuring panoramic views of the planet below. This is the sovereignty of the high-altitude grave. Here, Winter finally confronts the director, who has transferred his consciousness into a specialized T-800 class synthetic combat frame. This is the lore of the transhumanist nightmare. The director doesn't just want to survive. He wants to evolve into a being that can outlast the stars. This represents the sovereignty of the cold perfection. The director is armed with a directed energy railgun, a weapon that can pierce marine armor like paper. Winter must use the M5 RPG-7 to destroy the deck support pillars, using the environment to pin the synthetic down. The battle against the director is a clash of tactical sovereignties. While the director has superior speed and strength, Winter has the sovereignty of the Marines' adaptability. The deck is falling apart, with floor plates ripping away to reveal the clouds of LV-426 miles below. This is the lore of the vertigo combat. Winter has to time his movements between the station's gravity bursts, using the weightless moments to leap over the director's fire. The lore suggests that the director's synthetic mind is overclocked, allowing him to predict Winter's movements, but he cannot predict the structural failure of the station itself. Winter's survival depends on his ability to embrace the chaos that the machine cannot calculate. During the fight, the hybrid queen, freed from her nursery in the lower levels, tears her way through the floor of the command deck. This introduces the lore of the three-way termination. The Queen doesn't care about the company or the Marines. She is a biological hurricane meant to destroy everything in her path. This represents the sovereignty of the uncontrolled variable. The director is forced to divide his fire between Winter and the monster he helped create. The lore of the creator's regret is realized as the Queen's acidic blood begins to melt the director's expensive synthetic chassis. Winter uses this distraction to secure the master override key from the central console, the only tool that can unlock the executive shuttle. The atmosphere on the command deck is venting rapidly, and the hull integrity is at 5%. Winter finds Hicks, who has been pinned under a fallen support beam. The lore of the veteran's resilience is tested once more. Hicks hands Winter his own shotgun, the iconic Ithaca 37 from the 1986 mission. This is the sovereignty of the past torch. The lore of the old reliable proves that in a world of high-tech energy weapons, a 12-gauge shell is still the most effective way to clear a path. Winter uses the shotgun to blast through a group of Black Ops guards who are trying to hijack the shuttle for themselves. This represents the lore of the gritty survival, a return to the low-tech roots of the Colonial Marine Corps. The lore of the final betrayal occurs when the director, his frame half-melted by acid, attempts to upload himself into the USS Marlow, the Marines' rescue ship. This is the sovereignty of the digital parasite. He wants to use the Marines as a Trojan horse to reach Earth. Winter realizes that he cannot just escape. He must digital sanitize the transmission. This forces him into a data interface struggle while the room is literally burning around him. This represents the lore of the cybernetic sacrifice. Winter uses his technical torch to melt the station's main transmitters, ensuring the director dies with his falling fortress. This is the sovereignty of the total denial, a refusal to let the company's ghost follow them home. As the station hits the lower ionosphere, the heat becomes unbearable. Winter, Hicks, and O'Neill reach the executive shuttle, but the hybrid queen is blocking the airlock. The lore of the final gatekeeper is the queen's last stand. She is a broken, burnt creature, but her protective instinct for the data core is still active. This represents the sovereignty of the biological guardian. Winter must use the shuttle's external docking clamps to crush the queen against the station's hull. The lore of the industrial execution is the final beat of the fight. With a roar of hydraulics, the queen is ejected into the atmosphere, becoming a streak of fire in the sky of LV-426. The lore of the narrow escape is the final flight of the shuttle. As the origin station finally disintegrates and crashes into the atmospheric processor crater, the shockwave creates a massive dust cloud that covers the entire hemisphere. This is the sovereignty of the final curtain. The project is officially dead. Winter watches the explosion from the shuttle's rear window, holding the data drive that contains the names of every company official involved in the massacre. This is the sovereignty of the evidence. He has the truth in his hands, but the cost has been the lives of an entire battalion. The lore of the survivor's guilt begins to settle in as the shuttle sinks with the USS Marlow. The air in the shuttle is quiet, save for the heavy breathing of the three survivors. Winter looks at O'Neill, whose wounds are stabilized, and Hicks, who is looking back at the planet one last time. The lore of the long road home is the final theme. They aren't going back to Earth as heroes. They are going back as fugitives. The company will hunt them for the data they carry. This represents the sovereignty of the permanent war. The Golden Age is a nuclear winter on a dead moon, and Winter is the only messenger left to deliver the verdict. He slots the drive into his chest plate, ready for the next hunt. As the part ends, the USS Marlow turns away from the LV-426 system and jumps to Slipstream. The lore of the quiet void takes over. Behind them, the planet is a scarred, silent rock once more, its secrets buried under miles of ash and radioactive debris. But the lore of the Xenomorph is not over. In the dark corners of the Marlow's cargo hold, a single leathery egg that was accidentally brought aboard begins to twitch. The Golden Age is a cycle that never ends, and the sovereignty of the perfect organism is patient. The screen fades to black as the first facehugger finger taps against the glass of its container. The lore of Stasis Interrupted serves as the critical bridge between the 1986 film Aliens and the return to LV-426 in Colonial Marines. This chapter centers on the sovereignty of the missing link. It follows a new group of survivors, Lisbeth, Ethan, and Turk, who were on board the USS Legato when it intercepted the drifting USS Sulaco. The lore of the interception reveals that Weyland-Yutani did not find the Sulaco by accident. They had been tracking the ship's telemetry since it left the atmosphere of LV-426. This represents the lore of the corporate stalker. The environment is a haunting, quiet version of the Sulaco, still cold from the vacuum of space, where the remains of the fire and the ejected cryotubes tell a story of a rescue gone horribly wrong. The story begins with Lisbeth, a colonist who was woken up from stasis by the company to assist in the recovery of the Sulaco. This introduces the lore of the forced labor. The company used civilians as canaries in the coal mine, sending them into the dark ship to see if any xenomorphs were still active. The environment is dark and filled with the blue mist of the ship's automated fire suppression systems. This represents the sovereignty of the smothering atmosphere. Lisbeth finds the cryochamber where Ellen Ripley, Newt, and Hicks were supposed to be sleeping. The lore of the switch tub is revealed here. A facehugger had indeed triggered the fire, but the company managed to board the ship before the escape pods were fully ejected, capturing Hicks while the others were sent hurtling toward Fiorina 161. As Lisbeth and her companions move through the ship, they discover the lore of the body double. To cover their tracks and avoid a direct conflict with the Colonial Marine Corps, the company placed a deceased PMC, who had been killed by a facehugger, into Hicks' cryopod before it was ejected. This is the sovereignty of the forensic fraud. This explains why the Hicks found in the movie Alien 3 appeared to be dead. This represents the lore of the corporate shell game, where a man's identity is treated as a disposable asset. The environment of the Sulaco becomes a crime scene, where Lisbeth finds the DNA scrubber units used by the company scientists to erase any trace of their boarding. The lore of the Legato's secret is found when Lisbeth escapes back to her own ship. She discovers that the Legato was never a research vessel. It was a live-bait ship. The company had intentionally infested the lower decks with xenomorphs to see how they would interact with a civilian population in a closed environment. This is the sovereignty of the controlled massacre. Lisbeth finds her family in the observation pens, being monitored by Weyland-Yutani researchers. This adds a layer of personal sovereignty to the lore. She isn't just fighting for survival. She is fighting to stop her own child from becoming a host. The environment of the Legato is a chilling mock colony, designed to look like a home but functioning as a slaughterhouse. The Weyland-Yutani science officers are the primary antagonists of this chapter. These aren't soldiers. They are bureaucrats with scalpels. This is the lore of the banality of evil. They view the death of the colonists as data points for the board of directors. This represents the sovereignty of the analytical coldness. Lisbeth must navigate the genetic mapping labs, where the company is trying to extract the queen's pheromones from a captured specimen. The lore of the synthetic pheromone reveals that the company wanted to create a spray that would make humans invisible to the xenomorphs. This is the lore of the failed camouflage, as the aliens eventually realize the trick and turn on their captors. During her escape, Lisbeth encounters Stone, a rogue company PMC who has grown a conscience. This introduces the lore of the defector. Stone provides the sovereignty of the tactical intel, showing Lisbeth how to bypass the ship's internal sensors using frequency jammers. This represents the lore of the hidden war, where even within the company, there are factions fighting over the morality of the project. The environment of the Legato's engine room is a site of industrial sabotage, where Stone and Lisbeth work to overheat the reactors to prevent the ship from reaching Earth. The sound of the alarm is the sovereignty of the final countdown, a rhythmic reminder that their time is running out. The lore of the Hicks rescue occurs in the final act of Stasis Interrupted. Lisbeth manages to find Hicks in the high-security, quiet room. He is half-conscious but recognizes the Colonial Marine insignia on a discarded jacket. This is the sovereignty of the recognition. Hicks helps Lisbeth transmit the distress signal that Winter eventually hears at the start of the main game. This is the lore of the echoing call. The environment of the quiet room is white and sterile, designed to break a prisoner's mind through sensory deprivation. This represents the sovereignty of the psychological fortress. Lisbeth's sacrifice, staying behind to ensure the signal is sent, is what allows the USS Sephora to eventually find the Sulaco. As the Legato enters the LV-426 system, the lore of the orbital trap is set. The company realizes that a Colonial Marine ship is on the way. They decide to use the Sulaco as bait to draw the Sephora into a combat engagement, hoping to destroy the evidence of their boarding in the crossfire. This is the sovereignty of the trap. Lisbeth witnesses the company's heavy destroyers decloaking around the planet. This is the lore of the hidden fleet, proving that Weyland-Yutani has a military force that rivals the United Americas. The environment shifts to the observation deck, where Lisbeth watches the first Colonial Marine dropships approach, unaware of the ambush waiting for them. The air on the Legato is venting as the ship prepares to dock with the origin station. Lisbeth's story ends with her final report being recorded into a small data chit and hidden in the ship's maintenance conduits. This is the sovereignty of the legacy. While she does not survive the crash, her information is what Winter eventually finds. The lore of the Ghost Report highlights the theme that the truth survives even when the witness does not. The Golden Age is a puzzle of dead souls, and Lisbeth was the one who put the first pieces together. She represents the sovereignty of the unsung hero, the civilian who gave the Marines the chance to fight back. As this part ends, the Legato slams into the atmosphere of the planet, the friction turning the hull into a falling star. The lore of the intersection is complete. We now know why Hicks was alive, why the Sulaco was back at LV-426, and why the company was so prepared for the Marine response. The Golden Age is a contract signed in the dark, and the sovereignty of the truth is finally within reach. Winter's journey starts where Lisbeth's ends. The aftermath of the battle for LV-426 and the destruction of the origin station leaves a permanent scar on the history of the United Americas. The lore of the final verdict centers on the sovereignty of the exposed truth. Corporal Winter, Hicks, and O'Neill are no longer just soldiers. They are the primary witnesses to a corporate conspiracy that spans decades. The environment of the final transmission is the bridge of the USS Marlowe, a space that represents the lore of the military sanctuary. As the data drive from the origin is decrypted, the Marines realize that they have more than just names. They have the blueprints of the betrayal. This represents the sovereignty of the smoking gun, a digital record of every illegal experiment, every forged death certificate, and every life traded for a profit margin. The fate of the survivors is a story of perpetual exile. Although they have the truth, the lore suggests that the U.S. Colonial Marine Corps is heavily infiltrated by Weyland-Yutani sleepers. This introduces the sovereignty of the internal enemy. Winter and Hicks cannot simply go home. They are ghosts in the system. This represents the lore of the fugitive hero. They have become the very thing the company feared: a mobile, armed, and highly trained cell of resistance. The environment of the Marlowe is one of functional isolation, where the crew must constantly change their transponder codes to avoid being tracked by the company's orbital long-range sensors. The lore of the long run begins, a journey through the outer rim, where the law is whatever you can enforce with a pulse rifle. The legacy of the Xenomorph on LV-426 is the sovereignty of the scorched earth. The planet is now a dead zone, its atmosphere permanently poisoned by the multiple nuclear and thermal explosions. This represents the lore of the ecological martyr. However, the lore of the deep hive remains. The black box data suggests that the xenomorphs have a genetic memory that allows them to rebuild even after a total surface wipe. This is the sovereignty of the biological persistence. The Marines know that as long as one egg exists in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, the war is not over. The lore of the silent threat becomes the new standard for the Corps, leading to the creation of the Xenozip protocols, a set of extreme containment measures designed to prevent another Hadley's Hope. The Weyland-Yutani response to the disaster is the lore of the rebranding. Following the loss of the origin, the company enters a state of plausible deniability. They blame the synthetic director for going rogue, portraying themselves as victims of a mechanical failure. This is the sovereignty of the corporate mask. The environment of Earth's boardrooms is the new battlefield, where lawyers and lobbyists work to bury the data Winter collected. This represents the lore of the paper war, where the truth is not defeated by bullets, but by red tape and non-disclosure agreements. The lore suggests that while the Marines won the physical battle, the company is winning the information sovereignty, slowly erasing the events of LV-426 from the public record. The sovereignty of the Colonial Marine Corps itself is forever changed. The lore of the Acheron incident leads to a massive restructuring of the military. This is the lore of the hardened resolve. The Marines are no longer just bug hunters. They are a response force dedicated to protecting humanity from both alien threats and corporate overreach. This represents the sovereignty of the independent guard. New units, such as the Vanguard squads, are trained specifically in biomechanical warfare. The environment of the training camps on Earth's moon becomes a simulation of the Sulaco and the hive. The lore of the new breed of Marine is one of extreme skepticism. They are taught to trust the man next to them, but never the company that signs the check. Winter's personal legacy is the lore of the unbreakable will. He represents the sovereignty of the common soldier. He didn't have the hero gene or special powers. He just had a rifle and a promise to his squad. This represents the lore of the Marine Code. In the final logs, Winter reflects on the golden age of exploration, realizing it was actually an age of exploitation. The environment of his cabin on the Marlow is decorated with the dog's tags of his fallen friends, a physical record of the sovereignty of the lost. He is the archive of the Sephora, the one who remembers the names that the company wants the galaxy to forget. The lore of Dwayne Hicks concludes with his role as the strategic architect of the Resistance. He uses his knowledge of the Black Goo and the engineer ships to map out the company's future target sites. This is the sovereignty of the guerrilla war. Hicks becomes the mentor of the Dark, teaching the younger Marines how to fight an enemy that has no soul. The lore suggests that Hicks is the one who eventually contacts the UA intelligence to form a deep state alliance against Weyland-Yutani. This represents the sovereignty of the Shadow Alliance, a secret war fought in the black sites of the galaxy to ensure the Xenomorph is never fully weaponized. The final summary of the Colonial Marine legacy is the lore of the Eternal Watch. The Golden Age is a contract written in acid and blood, and the Marines are the only ones who can audit the results. The sovereignty of the human spirit is the final theme. Despite the perfect organism and the infinite corporation, the Marines proved that a group of grunts can stop the gears of a galactic machine. The environment of the galaxy is now a watchful peace, where every new colony is scanned for biological anomalies and corporate interference. The lore of the pulse rifle's echo is the heartbeat of this new era. As the final part ends, the USS Marlow disappears into the Great Dark, a lone ship on a mission of truth. The lore of the unfinished symphony is the final note. The Xenomorph is still out there, the engineers are still a mystery, and Weyland-Yutani is still hungry. But for the first time, the prey is hunting the hunter. The Golden Age is a war for the soul of humanity, and Winter is the only sovereign left to lead the charge. The screen fades to black with the sound of a single, steady heart monitor, the sound of the human race refusing to go extinct.